Hello everybody and welcome to this critique video. I know it's been a while, but we're back. And today we're going to be talking about 5 images from the lovely Brie Stockwell. She sent in some really cool dune photographs from the southwest of America. So the theme that we're going to be covering today is sort of twofold. We're going to be talking about perfectionism versus imperfection, and then also aligning your creative process, so that's sort of capture all the way through editing and eventually print, with the creative vision of the project itself. So without further ado, I've got the images loaded up there in Lightroom. Let's go ahead and take a look. So just to start with some of the context that Brie provided, she says that these 5 images are from a larger collection called The Way of the Wash. It's an exploration of the rigid washes and their connections to the dunes. My editing isn't necessarily meant to reflect reality. I've edited based on how I want the images to feel. Also, I should mention that this is my first black and white collection and that it's been really fun. So it's great to see somebody committing to a themed collection project. I think that's a really great way to work on the field. And as well, back in post-processing, when you start to sort of piece together images from a big trip, working them together into a cohesive project or collection like this is definitely a great way to grow as an artist. So I've got some sort of overall comments here about the full collection, and then we'll go through each image individually and see if there's some editing things as well that I might personally change. So I definitely think that there is an interesting relationship between the washes and the dunes, and the sort of idea of the project I think is really strong. And it's a great starting point for sure. Both ecologically, sort of the natural history of the place, but also aesthetically. The relative detail and quote-unquote messiness of the washes compared to the smooth rolling forms of the dunes. I think there's an interesting juxtaposition there. And there is something related to this sort of quote-unquote messiness that I think I would like to bring up, which is Brie has done a bit of cloning here. So when she says she wants her editing to feel she wants her editing to be based on how she felt, not necessarily reflect reality. That's where she's taken some creative liberties. I do wonder, however, though, if some of the cloning that she's done is necessary. There's a few exceptions, which I'll go through later in the video, which I think were necessary. But in some ways, I think a lot of the imperfections in the washes are part of their story. It's part of the water that runs through those small rivulets that shapes the landscape. And that's what is at the basis of this project. It's the relationship between, we'll go in here, the sort of messiness, or the detail, I should say, of the foreground, sort of slowly gradient up into the rolling forms of the dunes. And, you can see the hint of the relationship as well between the way that these dunes are rippling and the foreground washes. So some of the cloning I'm not as convinced by. I don't think it was 100% necessary. But again, that's something that's going to be subjective to everybody. And yeah, Brie will just have to make that decision up on her own. So having said all that, I do understand that your editing intention is more on feel, and the feel that I think you're going for here is that light, airy feel, and sort of very clean, almost minimal scenes. And I wonder if that sort of belittles the true reality of the washes themselves. They are very busy, very intricate ecosystems, and so there's sort of a mismatch maybe there between your processing and the story that this project could or is trying to tell. Obviously I don't have the full picture here, of your sort of artist statement for the project. There might be something that you haven't told me that I'm missing here, but that's sort of my take on that side of things. On a sort of broader note of the overall tonality and editing of the images here, I think it's definitely an interesting way of introducing variety throughout a body of work while still trying to strike that balance of finding cohesion between the different images. And obviously the way I've loaded up here, these photographs probably isn't the best order, because you end up with this weird skip between a very high key and a very low key image. So in your eventual presentation of this work, I think the sequencing is going to be really important. So as I say, there's sort of a careful balance to strike here between the cohesion and variety. And I think there's definitely a place for both of these images within the same project. It's just obviously a matter of how you present that. So delving more into the images themselves, Brie has provided the raw files, which was really helpful. And this one, there's not really too much actually really that I'll critique here. I like the 4x5 crop. I love the image. I like the central bush there just as an added detail to draw you through into the image, and it adds a sort of a three-dimensionality to it. That's probably where I would differ from Brie's editing approach here. I would go in and just bring down those blacks a little bit and really try to enhance that feeling of depth by using relative contrast between the layers. So I would probably take this into Photoshop, and I can just use the radial gradient here to show you the sort of layers that I would play with. So if I just copy that, so I would be splitting it up into sort of these bands of contrast. So you can see if I get rid of that light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. And that's one of the techniques that I definitely use throughout my editing process to try and convey depth and three-dimensionality. Moving on to the second image, I would probably say this is the strongest of the group. It has a clear intent. It has little to no cloning, which is, as I've stated, my preference. This bottom right-hand corner may be the only sort of small issue that's slightly distracting. It's just having something that's really high contrast right on the edge. But other than that, there is little that I would do to change here. This is definitely a keeper. Before I go on with the critique, I would ask that you please do consider clicking the subscribe button. It really helps to support the channel. Thanks. So moving on to the third image here. The high key is definitely a really good editing tactic, if you will. The light and airy feel sort of evokes very positive emotions, and overall I like that. But the decided lack of contrast in the scene really has left a lot of these areas that have detail just feeling a bit crushed. There's a lot of even grey tones in the foreground and equally in this middle dune that I think could be brought out further with a bit more contrast. That doesn't mean to say that the image needs to have a full range of blacks and whites. It's just sort of a micro contrast issue perhaps. And if I just pop this over into Photoshop really quick, I would probably go about doing this just with some curves adjustments using layers and setting, we'll invert that, just setting black and white points, and then can dial this in to however much sort of micro contrast Brie wants in her image. So we'll do a bit more here just to show I keep getting that drag the wrong way around. And again, it's playing around with sort of the dark light theme. So from before to after, and then you could even bring in a levels adjustment here and bring those up just a bit. And we can check the histogram. The histogram here is not too different to the original. You can see I've just widened those tones out a little bit. And to me, that sort of adds spatial dimension, but still keeps the overall feeling of the image as light and airy. So moving on to number 4, there's something here where the sky changes. So I'm not sure if you've replaced it or if it's just from a different frame, but anyway, that's not necessarily a problem. There is, however, sort of a strange thing going on here where the side lighting to the foreground is more luminous than the lighting on the sky or the lighting on these dunes. So there's a balance of tonality where the brightest thing in the frame shouldn't necessarily actually be this foreground. It should probably be the sky. So I think there is room to work with the sky here to do some dodging and burning. So again, if I go over into Photoshop and I make sort of a very rough curves layer, I would be tempted to bring these whites up quite a bit in the sky, and then you can also sort of pinpoint maybe some of these darker grey values. Where do they lie on the curve? We can bring those up and add some mid-tone contrast there. So I think for me that would be a better treatment of the sky, and then this you could go in further, maybe even dehaze a bit in Lightroom and brighten up and add a bit more texture to this middle bit. And I would treat the dunes in much the same way with a curves, and then we can just do a very rough mask here with a soft feather, mostly just bringing in more whites actually. Doesn't need that much more. So you can see there. And I think bringing in a bit more balance between the foreground and the other elements just helps the image lift and sing a bit. So back to Lightroom, the only other thing I noticed was that the crop wasn't a normal aspect ratio. It's not 3:2, which is a bit odd to me. So that might be something to play with. Overall though, I think the composition, the scene is really beautiful, well shot. Just the balance and the editing is a little bit off to me. And again, here's where we can see this bush, for instance, Brie actually cloned out, which I'm not sure if that was entirely necessary in my opinion. And then the final image here, not much to comment on the editing side of things. I think it's quite tastefully edited, especially the foreground feels really luminous. I think this was made on an infrared converted camera. So it's really cool with these sort of glowing foliage of the bush there. The one thing that I think is slightly awkward is actually there's some sort of patchy dodging and burning going on the dune here. So if we look at the raw file, you can see that that's much more flat compared to the edit. This middle patch here I find a little bit distracting. So that's something to work on. I think maybe a better or softer selection when doing that could help you there. But overall, I think the intention of setting this light bush against a darker background is a good one. And then this was the image with the most cloning. And most of it I agree with. So here we've got footprints and temporary, not part of the natural environment. That's fine for me to get rid of. The ones I'm sort of less convinced by are the removal of some of these bushes So you can see here those two bushes there are gone. And then again, in the background, I think there's some odd cloning going on here between, if you look between these two bushes in the background there, and then the raw file. These things are sort of, to my mind, part of the natural chaos and part of the natural way of the wash, if you like. So I understand you're trying to create a sort of a clean dune here, and the aesthetics of that are quite appealing. I don't know if it's necessary, because they're already deep in shadow, and depending on how you're thinking of presenting these, you know, if you're going to make prints, those small details will look lovely in a print. It just adds a bit more texture, and that's one of the key components of really nice black and white work. Obviously, you don't have the color to work with, so you rely more heavily on other formal components such as texture and detail. So to summarize, I think it's a great collection of work. It's a wonderful idea. There's just like some very minor editing tweaks and aligning the philosophy of your creative process with the philosophy of the project and the artistic vision that you've got for the story you're trying to tell. I think once those things start to match up, you'll have a really, really strong project and a fantastic body of work. That's going to be it for this critique video. I do hope you got something out of that and it was helpful in some way. Thanks, Brie, again for sending those images in. Really enjoyed looking at them. I'll leave a link down below to Brie's work, her social media and website, where you can go and find out more. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.